Thomas had been buried for just 3 weeks when his mother asked me to start paying rent. She said it gently, with tea in her hand and venom in her eyes, sitting across from me at the kitchen table where I'd served thousands of family meals. The house Thomas built was in his family's name, his father's, technically, and now they said it belonged to the bloodline. I stared at the framed wedding photo on the wall, the one from our ceremony 32 years ago, realizing even that would soon feel like stolen property. When I said I had nowhere else to go, his brother Marcus smirked and said, "Then you better start looking." His wife Diane nodded in agreement, her arms crossed tight across her chest. I felt my chest tighten, but I kept my face calm, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. 32 years of marriage, countless Christmas dinners, birthday celebrations, and quiet Tuesday nights, and suddenly I was nothing more than a tenant in the home where I'd raised my stepdaughter, where I'd nursed Thomas through his final agonizing days of cancer. The home I once built love in had just become enemy territory, and I was the unwelcome invader. They didn't throw me out overnight. No, they started small, chipping away at my dignity piece by piece. My things were moved into the guest room so we can use the master for storage, though I never saw them store anything except their contempt. My meals weren't included anymore. I had to cook separately and buy my own groceries, which I kept in a small corner of the refrigerator they'd designated for me. The pantry was suddenly locked with a padlock I didn't have a key to, and I needed permission to use ingredients I'd bought myself just weeks before. Thomas's mother, Patricia, watched me like a hawk whenever I entered the kitchen, her eyes tracking every movement as if I might steal the family silver. The house that once smelled like Thomas's cologne and fresh coffee now smelled like hostility and stale resentment. His sister Amanda barely looked at me anymore, walking past as if I were invisible, a ghost haunting rooms I no longer had claim to. When I tried to water the garden Thomas and I had planted together, Marcus told me to leave the landscaping to family, the word hitting me like a slap. I realized then that every small kindness was being stripped away systematically, methodically, and I had no idea it was only the beginning of my exile. When I asked about Thomas's will, they all looked at each other too quickly, their eyes meeting in a silent conversation I wasn't meant to understand. His mother said, "Thomas didn't leave one, dear. You know how careless he could be about paperwork." But Thomas was never careless. Not with me, not with our life, not with anything that mattered. He'd been a financial advisor for 30 years, helping other families plan their estates with meticulous attention to detail. He'd shown clients the importance of documentation, of protecting loved ones, of ensuring wishes were honored. The idea that he'd die without arranging his own affairs was not just unlikely, it was impossible. Something inside me began to stir, a quiet anger I'd never felt before, cold and sharp. If there was no will, why did Marcus suddenly start driving Thomas's vintage Mercedes, the car he'd restored himself and promised would be mine someday? Why was Amanda wearing my mother-in-law's sapphire jewelry that Thomas had explicitly promised would be mine, pieces he'd shown me in the safe? Why did Diane have keys to the safe deposit box I didn't even know existed until she mentioned it casually at breakfast? The questions multiplied in my mind like cracks in ice. If there was no will, then someone was lying through their teeth, and I was going to find out exactly who. I went to the family lawyer, an old man named Harold Pemberton who'd known Thomas since childhood, who'd attended our wedding and bounced our stepdaughter on his knee. He shuffled papers nervously and avoided my gaze when I walked into his wood-paneled office. The air smelled like old books, leather, and secrets that had been buried too long. When I asked directly if there had been a will, his lips twitched nervously, and he adjusted his glasses 3 times in 30 seconds. "Sometimes men make promises they never formalize," he said, his voice shaking slightly, the tremor betraying his discomfort. He kept adjusting his glasses, a nervous tell I recognized from years of reading people at Thomas's office parties. But when I stood up to leave, pretending to accept his answer, I noticed a folder on his desk, one with Thomas's handwriting on the tab, his distinctive script that I'd memorized from birthday cards and anniversary notes. The letters were unmistakable, precise, and deliberate. It read, "For Evelyn." My heart began to race. adrenaline flooding my system, but I kept my expression neutral and polite. I thanked him for his time, watching his shoulders relax with relief. That folder had my name on it, contained my future, but I knew with absolute certainty it wouldn't be there for long. They were covering their tracks, and I just caught them mid-crime. When I returned the next morning with a carefully prepared list of questions, the folder was gone. Harold claimed he'd cleaned his desk the night before, his eyes darting nervously to the empty spot where it had been sitting yesterday. His desk was otherwise cluttered with papers, books, and coffee-stained files. Only that one folder had been removed. I smiled politely, thanking him for his time with a sweetness that made him visibly relax, but inside I felt my blood turning cold with calculation. Someone had erased my husband's last words to me. Someone had taken what was rightfully mine and hidden it like stolen goods, buried it like evidence of a crime. That night, I sat on my narrow guest bed with its thin mattress and cheap sheets, staring at the water-stained ceiling, listening to Marcus and Diane laughing in the master bedroom. They were watching television in the room where Thomas had died, where I'd held his hand through his final breath, where he'd told me he loved me one last time. The sound of their laughter felt like knives. I realized with perfect clarity that this wasn't grief anymore. It wasn't sadness or mourning or adjustment. It was war, cold and strategic. And if they wanted a quiet widow who would disappear without a fight, pack her bags and fade into nothing, they were about to meet a storm they never saw coming. Thomas's cousin, Mira, called me one night around 11, her voice barely above a whisper like she was hiding in a closet or bathroom. "Evelyn, I saw a copy of the will. Thomas left you everything." My heart stopped completely, the world narrowing to just her voice and my pounding pulse. I pressed the phone closer to my ear, barely breathing, afraid to miss a single word. "But they made Harold sign a new version," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "They paid him off. Marcus found out about some mistake Harold made years ago, something with another client's estate, and threatened to report him to the state bar unless he helped them forge new documents." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. I hung up shaking, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped the phone, but also smiling for the first time in weeks. A real smile, not the polite mask I'd been wearing. Because now, I had proof that my instincts were right, that I wasn't paranoid or crazy or bitter. Betrayal always leaves a trail. Witnesses, documents, guilty consciences, people like Mira who can't stomach injustice. And I was about to follow that trail straight into the lion's den, armed with knowledge they didn't know I possessed. I stayed awake all night, making detailed notes, remembering every strange comment, every rushed conversation that had ended abruptly when I entered a room. They called a family discussion that weekend, scheduling it with the formality of a board meeting. When I entered the living room at the appointed time, they were already seated like a jury assembled to deliver a verdict. Marcus in Thomas's favorite leather chair, the one he'd spent years breaking in, Patricia on the sofa with Diane, and Amanda flanking her like guards or enforcers. The arrangement was deliberate, intimidating, designed to make me feel small and outnumbered. "We think it's time you moved out," his mother said, her voice dripping with false sympathy that made my skin crawl. "It's too hard for all of us to move on with you here. Your presence is a constant reminder of our loss." The irony almost made me laugh out loud, as if they were the ones grieving, the ones who'd lost everything. They handed me an envelope of cash, crisp bills that smelled like fresh ink, $5,000, to help me start fresh. Marcus said it was generous, more than they owed me legally or morally, more than most families would offer. His tone suggested I should be grateful, that this was charity I didn't deserve. I looked at the money, then at each of their faces, memorizing their expressions of fake concern and barely hidden relief, the way Amanda couldn't quite hide her smile. Then I said clearly, "You'll regret this kindness." The room went completely silent. Patricia's practiced smile faltered for just a moment. Marcus's jaw tightened. They thought they'd dismissed me cleanly, tied up loose ends, but I was just getting started on a plan they couldn't begin to imagine. I packed my things that night with deliberate slowness, making sure they heard me moving around upstairs. Thomas's watch, still keeping perfect time. A photo of us on our wedding day, both of us so young and hopeful. The small leather notebook he always kept by the bed for middle-of-the-night thoughts and reminders. I took nothing that could be disputed in court, nothing they could accuse me of stealing or claim as family heirlooms. Every item I packed had clear sentimental value, but no monetary worth they could contest. They watched from the balcony as I dragged my suitcase down the driveway in the cold rain, the wheels catching on the gravel Thomas had laid himself. Marcus actually waved goodbye like I was leaving for vacation. Diane recorded it on her phone, probably as evidence to prove I'd left voluntarily, that they hadn't forced me out or violated any laws. I didn't cry despite the rain mixing with something that might have been tears. I didn't look back at the house even once, because I knew if I stayed one more night in that hostile environment, watching them celebrate my departure, I'd burn the place down with my bare hands and everything I'd worked for. But revenge tastes better when served cold from the outside, when they think you're defeated and broken and gone forever. I loaded my car methodically and drove away slowly, letting them savor their victory, not knowing it would be the shortest celebration of their miserable lives. Inside Thomas's notebook were scribbles and notes, dates, account numbers, and one line that stopped my heart: transfer the trust fund next month to Evelyn's name. My pulse raced as I sat in my cheap motel room, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead like an angry insect, casting harsh shadows. Trust fund? He'd never mentioned one in all our conversations about finances. We'd lived comfortably, but not extravagantly, never taking expensive vacations or buying luxury items. He'd always said we had enough and seemed content with our modest lifestyle. I called Mira again from the motel parking lot, and she confirmed what I'd suspected. Thomas had a private account worth over $2 million from an inheritance his grandfather had left him decades ago. The same account Marcus was now using to buy new investment land and finance rental properties downtown. The same money they'd told me categorically didn't exist, that Thomas had spent or never had. My hands trembled with rage as I realized the scope of their calculated theft. They hadn't just stolen a house or some furniture. They weren't just stealing my home and security. They were stealing my entire future, robbing me of everything Thomas had worked his whole life to protect for me, everything he'd wanted me to have after he was gone. This was systematic, premeditated fraud, and they'd counted on me being too grief-stricken and too trusting to fight back or ask questions. I spent weeks searching through old emails, tax records, and bank statements Thomas had forwarded to me over the years for various reasons. I barely ate, surviving on black coffee and crackers and pure determination. My motel room transformed into a war room, papers spread across the bed, the floor, taped to walls, a conspiracy board of my own life. Then I found it buried in an old email folder labeled important, an old password hint Thomas had sent me 3 years ago, her middle name plus our anniversary year. When I entered Rose 1991 into his private file storage portal, the account opened like a vault, and there it was, a document titled Evelyn_TF_transfer, PDF, dated just 2 months before his diagnosis. My hands trembled so badly, I could barely click the mouse. The transfer was scheduled for 2 weeks after his death, automated and irrevocable. He'd planned everything meticulously, knowing his family's history of greed, knowing they might challenge his wishes or try to cut me out. He'd protected me even from the grave, left me a roadmap to follow. What I found next would shake everything I thought I knew, including my faith in the people I'd called family for 3 decades, people I'd cooked for and cared for and loved. At the bank, the manager hesitated when I mentioned Thomas's name and the trust account number I'd found. That account has been recently consolidated, he said carefully, adjusting his tie nervously and not meeting my eyes. By who? I asked, keeping my voice steady even though my heart was pounding so hard I thought he might hear it. He shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. His brother, Marcus Carter, under power of attorney filed 3 weeks ago. My breath caught painfully in my throat. That was impossible. Thomas had explicitly revoked Marcus's power of attorney 5 years ago after a disagreement about family money and investments. I'd been there in this very bank when he signed the revocation papers, had witnessed the signature myself. Could I see the documentation? I asked politely. The manager hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, then printed a single page with shaking hands. The signature at the bottom looked superficially like Thomas's, but something was fundamentally wrong with it. The date was 3 days after Thomas died, after I'd watched them lower his casket into the ground. My husband had supposedly signed a legal document from beyond the grave, granted power of attorney while lying in a funeral home. Unless someone had forged it with criminal intent, and I was staring at proof of fraud, evidence of a conspiracy that could send them all to prison. I went back to Harold's office the next day, pretending to be naive and defeated, playing the role of broken widow perfectly. I asked for a copy of the updated documents for my records, claiming I needed them for tax purposes and Social Security benefits. He hesitated, sweat forming visibly on his forehead despite the air conditioning, then handed me a folder with trembling hands. Inside was the forged power of attorney and a new will that left me absolutely nothing, not a photograph, not a memory, nothing. The signature at the bottom wasn't Thomas's. It was traced poorly by someone who'd never mastered his handwriting. The loops were wrong, the pressure uneven, the slant different. I'd seen Thomas's signature 1,000 times on anniversary cards, mortgage papers, loan documents, and love letters he'd left on my pillow. My hands shook with rage as I folded the documents neatly into my purse, thanking Harold with a sad smile that made him visibly relax. He looked relieved, probably thinking I'd accepted defeat and would disappear quietly into obscurity. But revenge didn't need violence or drama or confrontation. It only needed evidence, patience, careful planning, and the cold satisfaction of watching liars destroy themselves slowly. I had the proof now, documented and dated, and I knew exactly what to do with it. The game was just beginning, and they didn't even know they were playing yet. I rented a tiny apartment downtown, 3 blocks from the courthouse and 2 blocks from the law library. It smelled like old paint and rain and disappointment, but it was mine. No one could take it from me or tell me I didn't belong there. Every night, I made tea in the cramped kitchen with its ancient stove and wrote in a new notebook labeled Reclamation Plan in bold letters. Step 1. Expose the forgery through legal channels. Step 2. Take back what's mine through the courts. Step 3. Make them watch it all crumble publicly. I researched forensic document analysis, estate law, fraud penalties, and criminal statutes late into the night. I learned that forging a signature on financial documents was a felony, punishable by 5 to 10 years in prison. I studied their patterns, their weaknesses, their individual greed, and how it made them sloppy. The widow they pitted, the woman they dismissed as too soft and too trusting and too damaged by grief, was turning into something they should genuinely fear. And the beautiful thing about being consistently underestimated is that no one sees you coming until it's far too late to defend themselves. I was building a case brick by brick, and they were still celebrating their victory, completely unaware. Mira introduced me to her friend, an estate attorney named Victoria Cross who hates the Carters after they tried to cheat her elderly mother out of property in a boundary dispute years ago. Victoria reviewed the forged signature under her desk lamp and actually laughed out loud. "This is a felony waiting to happen," she said, holding the document up to the light to examine the paper quality. "Amateur hour. We can prove this wasn't his handwriting with a basic forensic analysis. Look at the pressure points, completely different from his verified signatures." She helped me file quiet motions under Thomas's estate name, requesting audits and document verification from the probate court. All while the family thought I was living miserably in my tiny apartment, broken and forgotten and too weak to fight. Victoria worked pro bono, motivated by old grudges and a genuine love of justice for wronged women. She'd seen too many widows cheated by greedy families. What the Carters didn't know was that I was rebuilding everything they stole brick by brick, document by document, motion by motion, filing by filing. And the foundation of their elaborate lie was already cracking beneath their feet, small fractures that would soon become chasms. They were living on borrowed time, and didn't know it yet. One day, scrolling through real estate listings on my phone during a sleepless night, I saw it. The family house was listed online for sale. They were selling it, liquidating the asset before any legal challenges could arise. The description called it a charming family estate with historical value and original hardwood floors. They wanted to liquidate assets and split the money between themselves quickly. Perfect. I contacted Victoria, and she connected me with a proxy buyer, a shell company registered in Delaware that couldn't be traced back to me through public records. I bid anonymously through the proxy, offering slightly above asking price for a quick cash sale with minimal inspection. When the deal went through after just 2 weeks, they celebrated at dinner, bragging about the money they'd make and how they'd finally gotten rid of the burden. Marcus posted on social media about new investment opportunities opening up. Patricia talked about finally taking that European vacation she'd always wanted. Diane bought a new car with her share of the down payment. They didn't know the buyer was me, the woman they'd thrown out in the rain, the widow they'd dismissed. They didn't know I was coming home, and this time, I wasn't leaving ever again. This time, I held all the cards, all the power, and all the legal documentation. 3 months later, on a cold Tuesday morning, a moving truck pulled up the driveway at dawn. They rushed outside in their bathrobes and slippers, confused and panicking, still half asleep. And there I was, standing beside the driver in a tailored coat, holding the deed with my name printed clearly at the top in legal font. "Good morning," I said calmly, correcting my earlier mistake. "You're trespassing on my property. I'm the new owner." Patricia's face went completely pale, all color draining away. Marcus started shouting about fraud and lawyers, his voice cracking with panic and disbelief. Diane actually stumbled backward and nearly fell. Amanda's mouth hung open in shock, frozen mid-step. Every bitter moment had led to this sweetness. Mira called one morning, crying hard enough that I could barely understand her words. "They're saying you destroyed the family," she said between sobs and gasping breaths. "They're telling everyone you're vindictive and cruel." I looked out the window at the garden I was replanting, the roses Thomas had loved, the soil I was turning by hand. "They destroyed themselves when they decided to erase me," I said calmly, my voice steady. I just held up a mirror to their actions. Everything that happened to them was a consequence of their own choices. She was silent for a long moment, and I could hear her breathing, thinking, processing. Then she whispered, "I think Thomas would have been proud of you for fighting back." Those words hit me harder than I expected, breaking through my careful composure. I'd spent months wondering if I was doing the right thing, if revenge made me as bad as them, if Thomas would approve. But Thomas had been a man of justice and fairness above all. He wouldn't have wanted me erased, forgotten, left with nothing after giving him my best years. For the first time since his death, the word widow didn't feel like a wound or a weakness. It felt like a battle cry, a declaration of survival. And I'd won the war they started. One night around 10, Patricia drove up in her old sedan and threw a glass bottle through my front gate. Glass shattered dramatically across the stone driveway, and I heard her screaming from the street, her voice raw and unhinged. "You cursed this house. You cursed this family. Everything was fine until you came along." She was hysterical, her voice breaking with emotion and rage. Neighbors came out to watch the spectacle, standing on their porches in pajamas. I stood calmly on my porch, still as ice, and called the police while she continued ranting about curses and evil and revenge. When the officers arrived within minutes, she tried to claim I'd stolen her family's property, that I was a manipulator who'd tricked her innocent son into marriage decades ago. But I had the deed, the court documents, the forensic analysis, and the witnesses to everything. The officers were professional but firm. They took her away in handcuffs, still screaming about curses and betrayal as they guided her into the squad car. That was the night I realized with complete clarity that revenge doesn't end with justice. It ends with silence, with the absence of fight. Eventually, they stop fighting because they've lost everything worth fighting for. And you're left standing in the quiet, victorious and alone, wondering if the silence is peace or just exhaustion. Weeks later, I received a certified letter from the state attorney's office that required my signature. Inside was the original will, Thomas's real will, the one Harold had hidden in his office. The lawyer had finally confessed everything before his sentencing hearing, hoping desperately for mercy he didn't deserve and wouldn't receive. The will left me the estate, the business investments, the trust fund, and the vacation property, exactly as Thomas had intended. But there was also a handwritten note tucked inside, folded carefully, in Thomas's distinctive script. "If you ever read this, it means you fought for it. That's how I knew you'd survive me. You're stronger than you think, Evelyn. You're stronger than I ever was. Never let them make you small or invisible. I love you always." I read it 3 times, tears streaming down my face, sitting on the floor of my study. He had trusted me to fight, to not give up, to reclaim what was rightfully mine. And I had done exactly that, followed the trail he'd left. He'd known his family might try this, had probably suspected their greed. And he believed in me anyway, believed I was strong enough to stand up to them. That note meant more than any property or money ever could. I renovated the entire home over the next 6 months, erasing every trace of their occupation and reclaiming every room. I replaced every broken tile, every faded curtain, every piece of furniture they'd damaged or stolen or used. I filled the halls with light from new fixtures, laughter from dinner parties with real friends, and framed memories of Thomas and me, photos from our travels to national parks, our quiet Sunday mornings reading newspapers, our anniversary dinners at that little Italian restaurant. I repainted the walls in colors I loved, soft blues and warm yellows instead of the beige they'd insisted on. I planted new flowers in the garden, varieties Thomas had always wanted to try. I installed new locks, new windows, new appliances, new everything. The house became mine again, truly mine. People in town whispered about me. The woman who rose from her own ashes, the widow who refused to disappear quietly. Some said I was ruthless and cold-hearted. Others said I was inspiring and brave. I didn't care what they said anymore. Let them whisper and speculate. It keeps the fear alive, the reminder that underestimating quiet women is always a fatal mistake. And it felt unexpectedly good to be feared instead of pitted for once in my 59 years of life. Months later, I received an invitation in the mail, an auction notice for the Carter family's final piece of land, their last asset. They were selling everything to survive the mounting legal fees and court-ordered restitution payments. I attended dressed in pearls and a black dress, my hair professionally styled, my head held high. When I walked into the auction hall, the room went noticeably silent. People stared openly. Some whispered to their neighbors. I took a seat in the front row, crossing my legs casually. When their property name was called and the land described, no one bid initially. The auctioneer called once, twice, 3 times. I raised my hand calmly and bought it for $20,000, a fraction of its value, less than 10% of what it was worth. Marcus was sitting in the back row. I turned deliberately and made direct eye contact. He looked away first, broken and defeated, his shoulders slumped. Revenge had never felt so quiet, so elegant, so surgically precise, or so absolutely final. I owned everything now, the house, the land, the legacy, the family name. And they had nothing left except their regrets and legal bills. The circle was complete, the balance restored. I hosted a dinner that night in the formal dining room, alone by choice. 1 plate of Thomas's favorite meal, 1 glass of good wine, 1 candle flickering in the center of the polished table. I sat at the same table where they'd once told me to find my own place, where they'd handed me $5,000 like I was a beggar at their door. I raised my glass to the empty chairs around me and whispered, "I found it. I'm home." The house was perfectly silent except for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock and the sound of rain against the windows. No one was telling me where I could or couldn't go anymore. No one was locking pantries or moving my things or making me feel small. I was home, truly home, right where I'd always belonged, where Thomas had wanted me to be. And it felt better than any revenge, better than any courtroom victory, better than watching them lose everything. It felt like peace, like I'd finally stopped fighting and started living again, on my own terms this time. The dining room felt warm and safe, and for the first time since Thomas died, I felt like myself again. Sometimes I walk through the garden in early morning and still expect to hear Thomas calling my name from the back porch, asking if I want coffee. But now it feels like he's here spiritually. In the wind that rustles the roses gently, in the warmth of the afternoon sun on my face, in the stillness of early morning before the world wakes. The pain doesn't sting sharply anymore. It hums quietly in the background, a reminder that I loved deeply and was loved completely in return. I used to think revenge would fill the void his death left behind, that reclaiming the house would make me whole again. But instead, it cleared the way for something better than wholeness or completion. It cleared the way for peace, for hard-earned self-respect, for the knowledge that I fought and won, that I didn't disappear quietly into the night, that I mattered, that my life had value, that my love deserved protection, and that, in the end, was worth more than any inheritance or property or victory in court. It was worth everything I'd been. That's what I did.